All right, so this continues out of that same discussion that for some reason had me thinking it was a good idea to tell you about the turnarounds or illegitimate argument, but there's a large lesson that I'm tempted to frame it as this is how you debate theory, but I would say that this is really how you strategize, and that is you want to be in control of what game you're playing. And it's kind of a bit of wisdom running through a lot of different formats of debate that the affirmative has a huge advantage because the affirmative gets to start up the game and the affirmative gets to lay out the playing field. There have been periods in the history of policy debate where the things that the negative was allowed to do really let the negative define how the game was being played, what game you really were out to win. The videos I made a few weeks back about a few chapters in the evolution of counterplans, and in particular about conditional counterplans. You could run a counterplan, and then if the affirmative made a bunch of offensive arguments against it, turns and disadvantages, you could just kick it out, because the theory of the day said that each counterplan was an experiment in a social science study testing the resolution as a question in political science, so therefore the experiments shouldn't bleed over into one another. If one experiment nullified the hypothesis and forced you to reframe it, then that justified a negative vote. So offense against counterplans, if you had 5 counterplans in the debate and they straight turned one of them, it was irrelevant to whether the other counterplans meant that you won the debate. When negatives could do that, the negative controlled the game. The affirmative would start in the first affirmative constructive with the stock issues, the advantages, the plan, and they would even try to do some things strategically up front to be ready for the barrage of counterplans. But really, the initiative went to the negative. The negative was really in control. And then there were a couple of developments that happened. I'm sure there were a lot of developments. These are all developments that were in my corner of the debate world, but where affirmatives started to take it back, where the affirmative changed what game was being played. Now, the first development, to tell you about this, I have to tell you about an argument that's almost as bad, almost as shaky as the whole turnarounds are illegitimate thing. As a matter of fact, it's probably a little bit worse. There was a period in, this must have been the late 1980s, early 1990s, where it was trendy for affirmatives to answer disadvantages by saying the disadvantage was not intrinsic. And what it meant was that action which was consistent with the topic could be taken to avoid the impact of the disadvantage. Let me give you an example. If it was a politics disadvantage that whoever's currently president, I think at the time it was the elder George Bush, is trying to get a balanced budget amendment through Congress and out to the states for ratification, but the plan messes up the political game board and therefore we don't get a balanced budget amendment and it's disastrous for the economy. Well, the affirmative can answer it, not intrinsic. Pass a balanced budget amendment. And they would say, if you're making a decision what college to attend, and there's this completely bizarre spin-off problem that you might set in motion by going to this college, you would take other actions to address that problem. You would only change the decision to go to the college if the consequence was necessarily a part of that decision. So they would say, if we could have topical action and take simple remediating action to avoid this disadvantage, then the topic is still true. Now, I hope you have spotted the problem with this. The problem is it has the affirmative defending the idea, is the affirmative in the position of saying that they are responsible for testing the truth of the topic. And that puts them in a very weak position because that was really sort of the beginning idea behind hypothesis testing, behind conditional counterplans, and even counterwarrants, which is a discussion for another day. If the affirmative has to defend the general truth of the resolution, there are all kinds of strategic corners they are backed into. So the making arguments that disadvantages weren't intrinsic, that didn't last very long. I mean, the first thing was the affirmative had to concede that they were testing the truth of the resolution. Negatives also argued that it made the plan a moving target. They only have 2 hours to figure out what to say against a plan that the affirmative had as long as they wanted to write. And if they can make intrinsicness arguments, then the negative has to figure out not only the written plan text, but they have to predict the imaginations of both debaters. And they only have 2 hours to do it. And they said that's simply not possible. Another argument they made was that there was an infinite regress involved, that we run a disadvantage, you run an intrinsicness argument, we run a disadvantage to your intrinsicness argument, you run an intrinsicness argument to that. And we run out of speeches very quickly and we haven't resolved the issue, which is a fatal argumentative defect. So this thing didn't last very long until in the late 1980s, there were people who were still trying to get away with the run a bunch of conditional counterplans and overload the affirmative strategy. And along comes this young man. He debated at a private school in Dallas, and he, in his career, won the Tournament of Champions, won NFL Nationals, went on to college, and won the National Debate Tournament, so very good debater. And he changed the game. Because what people had been doing, what affirmatives had been trying to do to fend off conditionality, is they had been making conditionality bad arguments. It's bad for you to run conditional counterplans. It's fundamentally unfair to us. We devote our speech time, our scarce 2AC speech time, making offensive arguments, and you just make it go away. And I went into some of the detail of the common conditionality bad arguments in that other set of videos, and you can go back and watch those. And that was being fought out to a stalemate. Over the course of hundreds and hundreds of debates, or trillions and trillions of debates all across the debate world, sometimes the affirmative won, but very often the negative won. It was pretty hard to get judges to say you're not allowed to do that. Judges weren't that comfortable with that. And I will add, as kind of a broader lesson, you really have an easier task in front of you saying, if they get to do that, then that means I get to do this. That's an easier argument to win than they have made this move in the debate, therefore they lose the debate. Or they have made this move in the debate and that is not allowed, end of argument, on to impact, discard the argument. Those are hard to win, but they've done this, therefore I get to do this. That's a lot easier to win, because then the judge gets to look at your opponent and say, be careful what you start. So here's what this debater by the name of Steve, he started saying in the 2AC, they've run conditional counterplans, that's great. That legitimizes intrinsicness arguments. And he would make several, to all the net benefits to the counterplan. And all of a sudden, these negatives are put on the defensive. They're very much wrong-footed. And these are high school debaters who, they're not really that well researched compared to, college debaters as the baseline. And so they weren't really prepared to, on the spur of the moment, mid-debate, start a counter-warrants debate. So all this did is it stripped away all the net benefits of their counterplan and put them in a really hard position. And there were teams that really got chilled from running conditional counterplans against Steve. And so that's one example of changing the game. I saw a better one at the college level a few years later. Because at the college level, you would find a lot more teams who would say, okay, let's go. It's the 2NC now. We're going to run counter warrants. We've got the 2NC. This was a big mistake on your part. I have 6 or 7 counter warrants, plus we're going to keep our previous offensive strategy alive, mostly in the 1NR, and then your poor 1AR's head is going to explode. So there was a debater from the University of Kentucky, also a very good debater. Never won the National Debate Tournament, but he was top speaker of the National Debate Tournament 2 consecutive years. Very smart. I will say that I believe this move was a product of his thinking and of the thinking of his coach, a man by the name of Roger Solt, who I talked about a lot in the couple of videos about counterplan conditionality. Anyway, this debater's name was Paul. Here was his move. When you ran a conditional counterplan, he would run some offensive arguments against it. Now, you might think, big mistake, because the better his offensive arguments are, the bigger an incentive it creates for you as the negative to make the smart move, kick out of the counterplan, and completely waste his 2AC speech time, right? So the plan might be some sort of foreign aid, and you counterplan with have another country do it, have Japan do the plan. And he runs an offensive argument that Japan crowds out the United States' opportunity to re-establish its leadership in humanitarian assistance, which United States leadership would move humanitarian assistance up to the top of the global collective agenda of multilateral agencies, and without that happening, there will be refugee flows. Refugee flows lead to uncontrolled refugee flows, lead to brush fire wars in the developing world, which escalates and goes nuclear. Okay, here's this offensive argument on the counterplan. We think about our answers to it. We think about how we're doing on this issue over here, and we think, okay, counterplan's conditional. He didn't even argue conditionality bad. Let's just kick the counterplan. Except that wasn't a disadvantage to the counterplan. That was an add-on advantage to the affirmative. And you kick the counterplan out of the debate, and you don't answer it, and he says, the plan reestablishes U.S. leadership in the area of humanitarian assistance, prevents uncontrolled refugee flows. You thought you didn't have to answer it because you were kicking the counterplan. You now have a drop nuclear war. That's an example of what I mean by think about the psychology of what's happening in the debate. Think about, in the process of the debate, at the decision points where people narrow the debate, where people change direction, think about how can you wrong-foot them? How can you surprise them? How can you fundamentally change what kind of game is being played? And what I love about this is it's one of the best life lessons for advanced debaters to take with them for the rest of their lives. because you're going to run into too many people who want you to play their game. And you can get trapped in relationships, in workplaces, into playing their game. But what debaters can do, what debaters get an education in doing, is stepping back, seeing very clearly what game is being played, and seeing what their options are to change the game. I would even call that a very sound biblical principle. That there are people who want to quarrel with you, and it says in 2 Timothy 2:24-26, the Lord's servant must not quarrel, but must be able to teach and patient. Don't play their game. The world wants to play games with you about popularity and wealth and acquisition, and if you're not paying attention to what's going on in your life, you can get wrapped up in someone else's game. But what debate does is it gives you the opportunity over and over again to iterate through a process of entering into a game that you can step back and scrutinize. And you can make a choice to change the game. So, I want you to think about that. What kind of game are you playing? And is there a way you could reinvent the game to where you're playing it on your terms?